This is probably the first and the last time that I'll say that I'm live from a theatre near you. So when I heard the names of some people present here and when I heard of the literature, I was really wondering, why did you bother asking me to come here tonight? But nonetheless, I just want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to speak on a subject that's really important to me, and I hope it's increasingly important to you as well. I think I should just make a couple of things clear before I begin. First of all, I'm not a school teacher. I haven't been one, and as far as I can see into the future, I probably won't be one. So I just want to make that known, not at primary or secondary level. Another thing, though, that may give me some locus in the matter is that I am a parent of 5, and 3 of them attended Christian schools. So I do have in that way a first-hand experience of what it means to be part of a Christian school community and to be involved in Christian education. I'll say quite a bit about that as I go along. I think it's also worth saying that, of course, I am a minister of the gospel, so in that respect I am a public teacher of Christianity to all ages, so I'm sure that gives me some kind of locus in speaking about Christian education. Those are really my credentials, and you can evaluate them yourselves. I think it's worth saying too, before I begin, that it should be obvious to you that most of what I say will come from a Scottish context. And I have to be honest and say that I'm not familiar with the context of education here in Northern Ireland. Having said that, most of what I say should be common to you and me. And I think even if times and dates differ, the same essential principles and movements are probably going on in your schools, as I've known and experienced in ours in Scotland. So that's just one or two things to begin with. Maybe another couple of assumptions too. I'm going to assume, if you're here tonight, that you're interested in this subject. It's possible that somebody took you along because until now you haven't been interested. I identify with that. So I'm not going to come to you tonight as somebody who's always been waving this flag. Quite the opposite. So if you're a little skeptical, I understand, and it might be useful for you to know that I've been there myself too. I'm also going to assume that you don't actually know too much about this subject. Now, of course, some of you probably know way more than myself, but I'm still going to assume that you don't know too much about it. That's where I've pitched this, so that might be useful for you to know. The other thing I wish to emphasize at the start is that I'm going to assume that many of your questions are quite practical in nature. I know that at some level you may be wrestling with the theory of this. Is it really a good idea to have Christian education? Although the more you think that one through, the more absurd the question becomes. But in any case, maybe you're wrestling with it philosophically, but it may be the case that most of your questions are practical, like how does this actually work? What is the difference? What does it mean for my children? What does it mean for me? And so on, and so on. And it's really in the light of that that I'm going to take a particular approach. And the approach that I'm going to take is one where I come at this from the point of view of personal experience of the whole thing. Now, I normally don't like to do things from that perspective. I like to keep myself out of things. Maybe that's because I'm usually in a pulpit as a speaker where I need to be invisible. But in this kind of case, I think it's important for me to bring my personal experience before you, just to help you relate to it. And I've done that on the last couple of occasions on which I've spoken on this theme, and they happen to be online. And if you've seen them and heard them online, you'll notice that maybe there's not much difference in what I'm saying tonight. That's because if I tell you my personal experience in connection with Christian education, it's going to pretty much sound the same all the time. So apologies for that, but I'm going to assume that you haven't heard or seen that. So that's just one or two things to start off with, and I'm going to focus on, in good old ministerial style, on three things. I'm going to first of all tell you how I came to understand the concept of Christian education and believe in it. And both these are subtly different, they're tied together, how I came to understand it and to believe in it. And secondly, why I think it's vitally important, and I use the word vitally there as something that pertains to life and health, vitality, why I think it is vitally important, not just for your children, but for everybody's children. Because Christian education, in the last analysis, is for everybody. And it's necessary for everybody. And that's the way we need to see it, as something everyone needs. So there's a sense in which you need a missionary mindset when you're embracing Christian education. The third thing is how I found it to be rewarding in my own experience, and that of my wife too, in our family life generally. So how I came to understand and believe it, why I think it's vitally important, and how I found it just to be like that in my own experience. So how I came to understand and believe in it, which means that I'm going to give you a very brief overview of my life, how boring is that, in connection with education. First thing I want to say is that my primary school was really a Christian school, although it wasn't called that. I was educated in the early 1970s in primary school, which is a long time ago for some of you. It's ancient history for some of you present here. But for us in that school, it was a small community school. It was effectively a Christian school. By that, I mean that I had at least half an hour, sometimes 45 minutes, of Bible instruction and catechism. So I had that in my day school every day. And I can easily say that the classroom and the playground were both governed by the Word of God. I can definitely say that. In fact, I owe my knowledge of the Bible to my home and to my school, mostly to my school. You say, what about the church? In my primary days, not really so much to the church, but to the home and mostly to the school. So I want you to think about that for a minute. I stand before you as a minister of the gospel, and I can say to you that my early knowledge of the Bible and its implications and ramifications and all that was learned in the day school. Learned my catechism in the day school. Sabbath school was there. It was important, but it was run in the school. Believe it or not, the teacher who taught us through the week also taught us in the Sabbath school. And the church functioned well with that, understood that. Church was happy for parents to send their children to the Sabbath school because they got exactly the same instruction there as they got in the day school. The minister would sometimes visit the day school, but his presence wasn't necessary in the day school. If your school is really a Christian school, it doesn't need a minister popping in, except at the level of community relations and things like that. But if to call the school a Christian school, you need a minister calling every week, it's obviously not functioning properly. So I want us to clearly understand that too. So that was my primary education. Secondary, dramatic shift. I was most definitely not in a Christian school from that point onwards, and I was very conscious of that. Just as an example, in 1978, when I was in secondary school, in the remote western islands of Scotland, where you think everything is very Christian, In 1978, in the history department, I was taught evolution as fact. Notice, in the history department, not in the science department, where it was actually assumed to and taught, but I was taught it most clearly and most strongly in the history department, where there was a picture, you know the picture very well, of the ape that gradually stands up to become a man. That was taught us as effectively gospel. But the whole school was not Christian in the sense that no department taught anything from a Christian perspective. And I have to say this too, and I'll come to this later, if any of the Christians in my secondary school were teachers, I didn't know it. Maybe they were, but I didn't know it. At no point did they tell me that explicitly, and neither did it come through in the way they taught their subjects. So whatever I sat through, whether it was English or history, art and design, woodwork, science, no word of it. God was quite simply absent. So maybe it's the case that those Christian teachers just didn't take Christ to work with them. I don't know, but in any case, that's just the fact. Now, in secondary school, not only did the worldview of the school shift from what I had in primary, but I shifted with it. Make no mistake, I shifted with it. In spite of what I had been taught and what I had learned, I shifted. My mindset gradually adjusted to fit in with the mindset that was governing the school and the principles and the intellectual and philosophical system that was governing my secondary school. And that stayed the case until I was converted by the grace of God at 18 years of age. So from 18 onwards then, as a Christian, to the age of 30, when I had been a minister for 3 years, I had no thought of Christian education at all. So my first congregation was in the Western Isles of Scotland, and I spent all my time there not even thinking of the concept of Christian education or even hearing about it. To the extent that I had encountered it in my seminary training, I didn't agree with it. I can't say that that was thoroughly thought through. It was just a kind of visceral response. It was a kind of gut response that I don't like this. It's somehow niche. It's a little bit strange. Maybe the people who are teaching in these schools are a bit strange, and maybe the people who go to them are a bit strange. Now, I'm just being honest with you. I don't mean to be insulting anyone here. That's just how I saw it, honestly, at the time. I suppose I could sum it up by saying that I thought Christian education was unnecessary, that it was probably divisive and strange. Divisive. I'll probably come back to that too. What does that really mean? Church is a divisive thing. If you come to a happy heathen community and plant a church in the middle, you're being divisive. You're bringing a gospel sword into that place. You all know that. There's something about the gospel that separates a family, 3 against 2, as the Lord said, 2 against 3, mother against daughter, sometimes father against son. In that respect, yeah, maybe Christian education is divisive, but only with a view to being inclusive. And that's the way the gospel works anyway. But like I say, I'll come back to that. Now, 3 factors changed my thinking. Number 1, and no offense to Baptists present here tonight, I had to think through the doctrine of baptism very thoroughly. I had issues with it anyway, but as a pastor in Toronto, I was in Canada as a minister for a few years, we had an influx of Baptists. I was going to say invasion there, but that's not a great word. There were several reasons why we had a significant number of Baptists coming to the congregation. They brought their children with them. We had to think this through, and I had to work it through. And in the process of working it through, I came to see that a lot of Presbyterians were raising their children in a similar way to Baptists. And I began to think, what does this really mean? I began to notice that a lot of Christian parents were raising their children as though they were neutral. And when they came to a certain age, they could make their own choice. And I thought, well, hold on a minute. If that's the way you're going to raise your child, why are you baptizing them? I mean, surely the baptism or sanctification of the child means something radically different from that. And that set me to thinking, well, what does it really mean for me to baptize my child and to raise my child with a certain teaching and instruction? What does that really mean? So that was one factor. Can't be taken on its own because maybe it doesn't necessarily lead you to Christian education, as we call it, but it was one factor. The second factor was that I gradually came, just through wider theological reading, I came to a fuller understanding of what God's lordship or Christ's lordship really meant. What does it mean for Christ to be king of everything? For the Lord to be Lord of everything? My Lord, my child's Lord, my school's Lord, my community's Lord. What does that really mean? What does it mean for education? Is there such a thing as genuine knowledge without Christ? That question started to really bug me. Is there such a thing as a fact that is not God's fact and that can only be understood somehow in the light of God's lordship? And the more I understood the lordship of God, the more it began to make me think about this concept of Christian education. I've mentioned in a lot of talks like this that Oxford University required you to do theology first. Now you're going way back here, let's say roughly 13th century. If you were going to study physics, natural philosophy it was called at that time, theology first. Are you doing medicine? Year of theology first. Why? Why did you do a year of theology first? Because they believed that you couldn't really understand any subject unless you understood it from its proper perspective. It's God's medicine. It's God's cosmos. It's God's physics. It's God's chemistry. It's God's art. It's God's music. It's God's God-given body, God-designed body that you've got. So first year in uni was always theology. Good practice. It's interesting that Richard Dawkins, of course, wants to abolish theology from the Oxford curriculum. It's quite a stunning turnaround. How you can move from a place where it's the one thing needful to the place where it's the one thing dispensable. But that's a commentary on Richard Dawkins, also on our society. But even though I had all these things going on in my head, and this is important, I wasn't convinced by any argument until I experienced something. It's experience that changed my view. Or at least it's experience that clinched the arguments for me. In other words, I saw it work. And maybe that happens in life generally anyway. Sometimes, even when you're being drawn to the gospel, maybe you just have to see it work in somebody's life. Well, I saw Christian education work. And I saw it work because in God's providence, when I was in Toronto, I ended up being asked to preach in various Dutch Reformed churches, Canadian Reformed Church or Orthodox Christian Reformed Church, just a few denominations like that. And I remember I came to be impressed after being in a couple of churches by the vast number of children in the church. I mean, I was really, coming from Scotland, I was completely taken aback at this. The pews were all filled from the front of the church to the back with families. All the children were present. They were present from the youngest age to the oldest teenagers. And I thought, well, I've never seen this before. I've actually never seen this before. And I wondered about it, and I did ask the elders of the church, you've got a vast number of families here, and they're obviously large families, but they're families that keep attending church, irrespective of what age they are. And the answer to my question as to why these things were so was because they were, well, maybe I can put it this way. Right beside the church was a vast secondary school, a Christian secondary school, which had so grown and was so successful that it had become the school of choice for everyone in the community. They wanted in there. Even if they weren't Christians, they wanted in there. So it was primarily set up, certainly, for the Lord's people and the children of the Lord's people, but it was evangelistic too, in the sense that any family was welcome to send their child, providing, of course, they stuck to the rules and were prepared to accept the government of the church. In other words, you're welcome to come on the bus, but we're always driving it. And that's really what Christianity is about. Anyone's welcome, in a sense, to come on the bus, although I might come back to that too, from a practical point of view. Anyone's welcome on the bus, but we're driving it. Currently, the bus is being driven by others. But in Christian education, it's being governed by a Christian worldview, a Christian curriculum, and by Christian teachers. And that's the moment, really, when, for me, the penny dropped. The proverbial penny dropped. I began to pray about the situation, I began to think about the situation, and I began to read literature about the situation. All of this is in Canada, where there was significant access to good Christian educational literature, and, well, my heart and my mind were changed. One of the things I discovered when I was reading and praying was the historic importance of education to Christians. I was particularly mindful of the Scottish Reformation, where I discovered that education was right at the heart of the Reformation movement. Wherever a church was planted, a school was planted. It was extremely important to make sure that the children were brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And these schools were pivotal in reaching people that might not be directly reached by the church. Notice again the evangelistic emphasis. It was really, really important. And of course, I've discovered through the ages that Christian education has always been important in Christian mission. When I belonged to the Free Church of Scotland some years back, I noticed that wherever the church went, it established a school as well as a church. Why? It was a strange phenomenon, but I remember the Free Church of Scotland had a school in Peru. It was called St. Andrew's College, a large school. I mean, it had hundreds and hundreds of pupils, and it maintained that school for years. And whenever the headmaster would come from Peru to Scotland to tell us about this school, loads and loads of Free Church people would attend because they wanted to hear about it. And sometimes he had to say, look, why are you so interested in our school in Peru and you have no interest in Christian schools in Scotland? He says, I have to be honest with you and tell you that there are Christian education is in a far healthier state in Peru than it is in Scotland. But you come to listen to me and you do nothing about it here in Scotland. You could have heard a pin drop, but that was just a fact. Education has always been important to the mission of the church, as well as to the nurture of the church's children. I also discovered the rich Scottish educational heritage subsequent to the Reformation. Lots of people who are training to be teachers in Scotland would go to Moray House in Edinburgh or Jordan Hill College in Glasgow. Many of you will have heard of these famous teaching educational institutions. They were founded by the Free Church of Scotland. Who knows that? Not many people. Jordan Hill School is one of the best schools in Scotland. It was founded as a model school by Jordan Hill Teacher Training College to model what education should look like. So you went to Jordan Hill College to learn about education. You saw it modeled out in the Jordan Hill School. It was a Christian school. And people lose sight of that. In other words, people think Christian education is kind of new. It's not new. It's accepting agnostic education that's brand new. It's the idea of Christians being at ease with secular education that's new. At what point did the church decide it was okay for education to be agnostic or secular? That's the question. At what point did the church decide that that was okay? Because for hundreds and thousands of years, it was not okay for education to be from that perspective. So there was a rich Scottish educational heritage. In fact, prior to 1872, and again, here's where your own dates may become important in different ways, but in Scotland prior to 1872, and as I get older, that seems to get more recent, most schools were run by churches. Nearly all of them were run by churches. And in 1872, the churches handed over the control of these schools to the state. I'm talking about 700 or so free church schools, talking about 500 or so Church of Scotland schools, and other schools run by other Presbyterians and other Baptists. I'm talking about a vast number of schools. And when they handed over the responsibility and privilege of training and raising children to the state, there was a lot of debate about it in the churches at the time. There were some people in the churches who said, look, this is dangerous, because down the road this could be problematic. If we let the state rule the churches, there could be problems. The most influential voices in the free church to which I belonged at that time said, now listen, this is what they said, we cannot envisage a day when Scotland will not be so thoroughly Christian in such a way that every school will always be a Christian school in Scotland. If you walk through Edinburgh on the Lord's Day, you'll see how absolutely blinkered and misguided that idea was. People who thought that were speaking in a day when 20,000 people could line the streets when Thomas Chalmers was being buried. So maybe you can understand why they thought that this is an irreversible situation. This is a Christian country for life. So let's hand them over to the state, because the state will always honor the schools as God-centered Christian schools with a Christian worldview. Big mistake. That stayed the case for quite a while. But of course, it didn't stay that way forever. And the church decided from that point that it was safe enough to leave education in the hands of the state, and meanwhile they would function with Sabbath schools. Now, I don't know if the Covenanters amongst yourselves felt the way Covenanters felt in Scotland, and indeed most free church people felt in Scotland, that Sabbath schools were not really for the church's children. Sabbath schools originally in Scotland were as they were originally in England. They were emergency setups to deal with people who were getting no education at all in the Bible or in anything else. The decision was taken on Sabbath afternoons to bring them into churches and teach them something. Teach them to read, teach them to write, and use the Bible as part of the process in doing so. It was assumed that Christian children would be learning at home anyway with their parents, and they'd be learning in schools. So from that view of Sabbath schools, the church suddenly changed to a view where Sabbath school becomes everything for the child. So in the services, they might not particularly be attentive or listening too well, but it didn't matter because they would get their Christian education in the Sabbath school. Half an hour a week, okay? So they used to get 30 hours of Christian education in their schools. That was then suddenly reduced to a half hour a week. I then also discovered what should be pretty easy to discover that people tend to drift away from church just around the time they've finished their education. Now, I had always thought that that was just because they're teenagers or 17 or 18, and that's what people do. They drift away from the church and they turn against it. And then I started to think, why am I expecting that? Who programmed me to think that it was a normal thing for the child of Christian parents to turn their back on the church at 17 or 18 years of age? And I began to think, may there be some connection, may there just be some connection between the fact that they've been raised in agnostic systems of education, secular systems of education, humanistic systems of education. May there just be some connection between the fact that they've been raised in that and the fact that they turn their back gradually on church at 17, 18 years of age. And of course it is no accident, is it? They have become used to a system that is in a profound disconnect from what they have at home and in church. And as they've grown up, increasingly, church has become peripheral because it's only Sunday, really, or the Sabbath. That's all it is. 3 hours, say, on the Sabbath, right? And that suddenly becomes something unusual for them, which doesn't fit in to their new world. From Monday to Friday, perhaps even somehow Saturday too, when you think of educational spillovers, where their peers, their education, their worldview, coming from teachers, is different. Completely different. Different presuppositions, different way of thinking, different way of behaving. And they suddenly see, well, that's one life. This is another life. This other life seems to be what the world's about. This other life now seems a bit funny and strange. And they drift away from that, and they drift into that. And I'm talking big numbers here. Scotland is, and always has been essentially since the Reformation, a fundamentally Presbyterian country, where hundreds and thousands of children are baptized and supposedly raised in church. How come there are so few of these people now found in churches? Why is it that we had hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of boys and girls deserting the church, despite their baptism and despite the church praying for them? Did it have something to do with the fact that at 5 years of age, they suddenly began their learning and their nurturing in an environment that was alien, a profound disconnect? I have come to believe long ago that there is a fundamental connection between these two things. And we need to take it really, really seriously. So, from that period, that drift was there. I also discovered an unusual phenomenon, that the worse the situation got, the less the church seemed to care about it. And that is counterintuitive. You would expect that the worse the situation got, the more the church would care about it. But I go back again to my Free Church days. Just for clarification, I'm an RP minister now. I'm in the Reformed Presbyterians. But in my Free Church days 40 years ago, there was considerable debate amongst ministers along the lines of, we've got to do something. This is 40 years ago. We've got to do something. I remember a couple of moderatorial addresses at assemblies that were addressing the need regarding Christian education. But as the situation got worse, people talked about it less. It's just what happens when you get used to things. And it's the drip, drip, drip effect. You adjust to it. I mean, there was a kind of process that went on, because people would first of all decide that there was something going on that was outrageous. Then we need to do something about it. We need to do it soon. But the soon never came. And the result was that people just moved on. The situation got worse, and the church seemed to care less. for myself, while I was still in Canada, in fact, I think we're all converted at certain times. I was converted to Christian education on the plane, really, between Toronto and Glasgow. When I was coming home for a holiday. That's where I felt the Lord really dealt with me in terms of this. When I went back on the plane, we started taking to do. The first thing we did was homeschool, which, again, I'm going to be honest, I confess we found difficult. Maybe it was because we lived in a manse, I don't know. We had a small child as well as the two that we needed to teach, and we found it difficult. I was not around as much as I think I could perhaps or should be. And let me be clear, although I'm speaking for Christian education, and although I'm going to confess failure as a homeschooler, I don't condemn homeschooling. And I admire people who homeschool, and I have nothing negative to say about that. I still think, of course, from my perspective, that it is a good thing to come together communally in Christian schools, but I am not anti-homeschool, absolutely not at all. And when I soon came back because I was called to a church in Stornoway, I immediately began to promote Christian education. And several families were interested, and 25 years ago we set up a Christian school, which, I have to be honest, just didn't get much acceptance early on, for a whole host of reasons maybe. I'll come to some of them in a second. But the school's still there, and it is growing, and my wife is now the head teacher. We've been away from Stornoway for years. We've come back, and she's become the head teacher of it. She enjoys the school, and the school is prospering. Like I said, I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, second, I'm late, but why is this vitally important? Well, maybe it's better to ask what's really gone wrong, and why isn't education the way it should be? Maybe that takes us to the basics. What is Christian education, or what is education? I mean, have we thought that through? And sometimes when we look at things, we need to begin by defining our terms. I mean, you hear the word education all the time, and you use the word education all the time. What is it? What is the word etymologically? What does it mean? It's from a Latin root, and you learn lots from looking at words. It means really to lead a child out, or to lead out. The word child isn't in it, but to educare is to lead out, or to guide out. So the idea of leading and guiding is at the heart of education. Not simply leading and guiding, but leading out and guiding out. Which, of course, gives rise to the question, leading out of where? Guiding out of where? Which, of course, gives rise to the question, guiding into where? And leading into where? These are the important questions. I mean, I suppose, first of all, you would imagine that, well, surely education is about leading out of ignorance and into knowledge. Well, yes, I get that, and in a sense that's true, but that's not really what the word conveys. The word conveys, and this roots back to the Bible actually, not just to the Latin world or to the Greek world, but to the Hebrew Bible too, as we'll see. The primary idea is to lead someone from one state into another, from childhood into adulthood, or from immaturity into maturity. That's what it's all about. So if you are sending your child to be educated, which you'll remember, by the way, is your responsibility. I know you delegate it. You're either delegating it to the state, you're delegating it to the church, maybe you're delegating it to a tutor or to a parent-controlled setup. Doesn't matter who you delegate it to. Well, it does in one way, but you're delegating it. The buck stops with you. When you give account at the judgment seat of God, you give account for how you've raised your child. I mean, you know that. Just like the Prime Minister of the UK will not just appear before the Lord as Keir Starmer, he will appear as the Prime Minister of the King's government of the United Kingdom. Charles himself will not appear before the judgment seat as Charles, but as Charles, the King of the United Kingdom and supposedly the governor of the Church of England. Well, so you're not just going to appear for yourself as such on the day of judgment. You will give account for the souls that God has placed in your care. Now, I suppose when I say souls in your care rather than children in your care, that hits you differently. I remember as a Christian parent, the first time I held our child, our firstborn, in my own arms, it didn't so much feel like a weight on my hands as a weight on my shoulders. I thought to myself, this is a soul. God has sent this soul into the world and said, here, raise this child for me. Raise this child up to love me and to know me, and make sure that every decision you make in connection with this child will lead to this child knowing me and loving me. And I thought of that at baptism, and I began to think of it in connection with Christian education. So it's our responsibility, but normally in the world we delegate this to teachers who we believe in either one area of education or in several are more competent than ourselves, or they have more time to do it than we do it ourselves. Either way, we just delegate it. Now, if these teachers are going to lead our children from immaturity to maturity, or from childhood to adulthood, we realize right away something we all know deep down, that education is about leading and guiding the whole child. They talk about holistic education, educating the whole child. They're absolutely right. A real educator will educate the whole child. A real teacher is not concerned to impart facts. That gets to be quite boring. A real teacher will recognize that he or she is going to impart facts in the context of values and ethics. If they are real teachers, they are interested in cultivating your child as a person, as a character, with understanding and with wisdom, the ability to discern what's true, what's false, what's right, and what's wrong. You say, oh, well, surely that belongs to the church or whatever. Well, of course, yes, it does. It also belongs to the educator. A real teacher will recognize that as his or her duty. And in fact, it's part of the honorable nature of a teacher's calling. And let me say right away that a teacher's calling is a profoundly wonderful calling. They, taking their position seriously, are taking your child and raising the child, you hope, the way that you want that child to move from immaturity to maturity and from childhood to adulthood. So they're not just going to be teaching facts. They are going to be telling your children what they should do with those facts in their own lives and in the lives of other people. Because after all, every fact has a context. You can only understand a fact inside its framework. And the teacher will help your child to construct a worldview, to use the facts in a certain way. Let me put it just this way to you. The teacher will tell your child a fact. It'll tell your child how to understand and interpret that fact inside a worldview. The teacher will help the child to evaluate this fact. Is this fact good? Is this fact bad? Or is this fact somehow neutral, if such a thing is possible? The teacher will also tell your child how to apply this fact, like I said, to themselves, and indeed to other children, and indeed to adults. And when you think about it, that really permeates every aspect of your child's life. Suppose your child turns up to school on the first day, and the teacher calls the child, says, it's nice to have you here. We love to have young boys. Boy, girl. This is suddenly a problem. Is it a boy, necessarily? Is it a girl? Am I allowed to say girl? Am I allowed to say boy? Notice immediately that even this most basic of facts is inside a worldview. It's inside a system which will be being imparted to your child, either in a good way or in a bad way. Your child learns about animals. What will your child be taught about animals? That their life is just as important as a human life? That they have evolved like we've evolved, and therefore they're, like I said, just as important, just as entitled to respect? That it's wrong to kill them, that it's wrong to eat them? I've had quite a lot of parents telling me that their children are being slowly pushed into becoming vegans or something like that. Now, the Bible doesn't allow that. You can choose to abstain from meat if you want. You're free to. But to make it a biblical position is not something you're allowed to enforce upon anyone else. But yet, this kind of thing is pushed. In fact, just to make the general point, I've been surprised recently how many parents have said to me, we can't believe what our teenage children are thinking. We say things at our dinner table, and our children are suddenly saying, no, you shouldn't say that. Don't be talking like that. And I say, how come you started thinking like this? It's because of where they're spending all their time and the people they're spending all their time with. Not just in education, but in recreation. The whole world is immersed in this now, and we shouldn't be surprised when they suddenly say, you shouldn't talk like that, or capital punishment is evil, or abortion may be okay, or whatever it is. You'd be surprised what some Christian parents are finding in children that they thought they had raised in the right way. I don't mean to be hard on you like that, but I feel, on the other hand, we must tell the thing as it is. There's this turning away as education declines. So, like I said, every fact is like that. So the teacher teaches facts, how to understand them, how to evaluate them, how to apply them. And every real teacher, like I said, sees it like that. If you tell a real teacher that their point is just to teach, their function is to teach facts, they'll laugh at you, and rightly so. We can't afford to undervalue teachers or to underrate the teaching profession. A true Christian teacher, for example, will be highly frustrated, certainly in Scotland. Really, really frustrated. Because a Christian teacher will want to develop this child in a certain direction. And their hands are tied. Certainly in Scotland, like I said, please don't think I'm commenting on your system necessarily. I honestly don't know it that well. But in Scotland, their hands are tied. There's so much they can't say. And it's not a matter, really, sometimes of whether I have to do something that the government tells me to do. Sometimes it's the other way around, that I can't say what I know I should be able to say. Can't say it. Can't do it. I remember going to Jordan Hill School, where my son was for a while, and something was being shown in class, and he just went up to the teacher and said, I don't think I should be watching this. Can I go to the library? And the teacher wasn't at all happy that he go to the library, but teacher thought about it, said, okay, go to the library. I went in to see the relevant person in connection with this, and believe me, what was being shown was not good. You know, it was a same-sex couple in an intimate act that was being shown in the classroom. And I said to the person, I said to her, look, you know, and I started to explain what's wrong with this, and her face was kind of still, and then periodically she would say, like this, nodding her head, but she wasn't saying anything. And I gradually came to understand that she agrees with me, but she's not allowed to agree with me. She was basically saying, I know, but that's what it is. And that's how it is. And that indeed is how it is. And a true teacher will be really frustrated. I mean, if that woman really cared about that, she's going to be frustrated. And really, at the end of the day, we sometimes found when we set up schools that Christian teachers took offense and said, well, you're attacking us. And we sometimes say, well, I'm not attacking you, actually. We wish the churches would liberate you. We'd like to see a whole army of Christian teachers being allowed to do what they want to do and what they're supposed to do, and really model these children, not by just getting a little word in maybe here or there, but really making a difference in the lives of children of Christian parents and children of unconverted parents. Release a vast army of evangelistic teachers into society. That's what we want for you if you're a teacher, far from attacking you. And it doesn't make sense to attack a Christian teacher anyway, who's just as you wouldn't attack a missionary for choosing not to be in a Christian country, because the whole point of them going there is to try maybe to do that. In the same way, if you feel that you have a calling, maybe in a state system as a teacher, okay, think it through, work it through, providing you can be faithful and consistent there. But this primary calling here is to teach and nurture and raise children from all kinds of backgrounds to be nourished and nurtured into the image of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, the thing is that it's not only teachers who know that they're to lead and guide the whole child. Those who've designed the system of education know that too. They're concerned with the development of the whole child. That's why they design the curricula, for those who are Latin scholars there. They designed the curricula to be of a certain worldview, offering a certain kind of guidance and instruction, and containing a certain kind of discipline. And that's why the current system of education in Scotland, let me say this, is so successful. It's really good. What do you mean by really good? It's producing the kind of pupils it wants to produce. It's really good. It's very successful. There was a very important international educational conference where Scotland was set up as a kind of model as to how to implement a thoroughly secular state system of education. Scotland, the land of John Knox and of Christian education, was held up as a model for how to thoroughly secularize a state system of education. Now, if you want to design a curriculum that is essentially humanistic in philosophy, relativistic in ethics, and agnostic in religion, if you want to design that system, if you get children coming out of the school who are humanistic, relativistic in ethics, and agnostic in religion, that school is successful. So the Scottish schools are profoundly successful. They churn out thousands upon thousands of agnostics who are completely relativistic in their ethics. They're good schools from the perspectives of those who have designed the curriculum. Too many of our children are caught up in that. Too many. And like I said, we're still not taking it seriously. So they have led those children from immaturity to maturity. They leave the system at 17 or 18 just the way they want them. These children, many of them went in bright-eyed, innocent, eager, wanting to know about God, wanting to learn about Him, only to discover that when they mentioned His name, they're told to be quiet. I remember when, due to various reasons, one of our children had to go to a state school for a time. Having been in Christian education, there was an incident of profound swearing in the classroom. My child went to the teacher and said that Jesus' name, was being taken in vain. That's not the words he used. He was just a small child. The teacher said, that's the way some people talk. You've got to just recognize that. There's no punishment for that kind of thing. Now, sometimes I feel that little incident sums everything up that's wrong. In a Christian school, you're going to find some people who swear as well. It's not a sanitized environment. It's not absolutely pure. And especially when children come in from elsewhere, but they don't need to be from elsewhere. Our own children aren't pure like that either. Some things are going to be said that ought not to be said. The difference is made by who's driving the bus. You think of the difference. See what would have happened in the previous schools. The teacher would take that child in and would open the Bible and show that child why they shouldn't use the name of Jesus like that. And then the teacher would pray with that child and encourage that child and send the child back out to the playground. Do you see the difference? My own son felt suddenly that he was an alien in the school. Now, I could take the position, oh, well, he's being a missionary here. He's not. He's suffering. I don't accept the little missionary theory that we send our children to do the dirty work that we're not prepared sometimes to do ourselves. They're not little missionaries in the school. Really, they're just little seedlings. That's all they are. And they need an environment where they can grow strong before they go out there. We don't want to send them out in their innocent, vulnerable condition to accept situations where they're being told from the top that their Christian faith is not really worth all that much. That's not what I vowed at baptism, really. And I came to see that, and I had to work hard in difficult situations where there were no Christian schools to try to set them up and to try and get other people to think the same way. So, the state system has led too many children from immaturity to maturity, or from childhood to adulthood, to turn out relativistic, humanistic, and if not atheistic, then absolutely agnostic. And if we have a real understanding of what education is about like that, you'll understand immediately that it's got to be woven. It's got to be in the warp and woof of every subject. Christian education is not about RE. Can I say that? Could I trumpet that? It's not about RE. I know what RE is. I've sat through reasonable RE. I've sat through bad RE. The system of RE in the Scottish education system has gradually been reduced to a few competing religions where you're not allowed to say that anyone is better than the rest. That's what it's been reduced. I don't know. It could vary in schools here. But it's not about RE anyway. When I send my child to history, I want him to see history through God's eyes, because those are the only eyes through which you see it properly. That's the point. Unless you are studying history through the proper lens, you're not evaluating the story of the world in the way that you should be. You're going to misunderstand why certain nations have risen and fallen at certain times, because you're not looking at God's program. Same is true with everything. I mean, when I'm looking at the world and at geography, I'm thinking of the creator of the cosmos, of the heavens and the earth. I'm thinking design, not accident. When I'm thinking about music, I'm thinking about God as the author of music and the one who delights in music. And that's how I want to study music. And I want to think of music as conveying a message. And I want to think of music as conveying the message that God wants me to convey through music. In a school, you're never going to be, in a secular school, you're never going to be taught that. You're going to be taught that you're the master, music's your servant, and you make it say whatever you want to make it say, whether it's ugly or beautiful. What is ugly and beautiful? That's what the school specializes in. What's ugly? What's beautiful? You decide. God decides. And if you're happy with your child deciding all that, who are you? Who are you, really, as a Christian parent? So it's the foundation of all subjects. All subjects. And you're to bring up your children in the Lord's training. Bring up your child in the Lord's training. Now, I want you to see a connection here between education and, again, with due respect to Baptists, between education and your baptismal vows. The expression you normally use when you're taking a baptismal vow is that you promise to raise your child in the Lord's training and admonition. To bring up your child in the nurture and admonition. Bring up in Greek means to lead from one state to another. Do you recognize that? That's the word education. Educate your child in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Paul's not talking there about a little niche in your life, like a bedtime story. He's talking about the whole package. Lead out your child from immaturity to maturity. That's what Paul's saying now. It's not what education's saying, not what the word is saying, but what the word is saying. Lead your child from one stage to another. And in fact, inside that Greek word is the word feeding. The word feeding. As you lead your child from childhood to adulthood, you are feeding them with information and with truth. Just as you're feeding their bodies, you're feeding their minds, you're feeding them their souls. You should feed that with whatsoever things are good and lovely and of good report, and so on, as Paul says to the Philippians. The things that they need. So their minds are to be fed on the Lord's training, his teaching and his discipline, facts and values. You mustn't separate these things. God says, it's my world, my standards, teach them my world in the light of my standards. If you're not feeding them, someone else is feeding them. The question is, with what? With what? So you guide your child to learn and to evaluate the world and everything in it. And God commands you to apply that to your child, to make them wise in their decisions, make them understanding, make them kind and gracious and loving from a biblical standard, not from this mushy tolerance that accepts everything except real Christianity. Now, Paul says if we raise our children like that, he says we won't frustrate them or exasperate them. Train up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Don't provoke them to wrath. Have you ever thought of what provoking them to wrath means? Well, I think it's what happens when we really confuse them with contradictory messages. And when we expose them in a bad context to worldviews that are destructive to them, they learn rebellion, they learn dissatisfaction with home life, they learn dissatisfaction with the standards of the home and the church, and they start to get moody and sultry, resentful. They start to get rebellious. Have you ever thought that that's not being a teenager, that that's because they're being provoked to wrath? Because they're not actually being channeled fully in the direction that they should be. Now, by the way, please don't make the mistake of thinking that I've got all this worked out and that I've done it all well. I don't. I know some parents say, well, we did everything we could for our children. I'm not actually that confident. I'm not that confident to say that. I sometimes have a good, long, hard look at myself and say, did I actually? Did I actually? Did I expose them maybe in a way that I shouldn't to certain things for too long? I don't feel my hands are clean in that connection. So I hope you think the same way. Don't just say, oh, I've done everything. Well, have you? Have you made the best decisions for your children? Are you tonight making the best decision for your child? So, what went wrong with the school system is not poor standards of literacy or numeracy or discipline. Everybody, when people talk about the problem in schools, they talk about, oh, there's poor literacy, poor numeracy, poor discipline. That's not the problem. The problem's the philosophy being applied to the curriculum. That's the problem. Now, I just want to move on because I've taken up too much time, and because I do want to say something about my own experience in connection with this. Because that is really important. When we sent our children to school, it was important in their lives for a whole host of reasons. We discovered right away that the Christian school, made a difference. Number one, from the day they started, they were happier. Right? Now, I want to make that crystal clear. We noticed that from day one, our children were immediately happier. Number two, they were immediately more interested in the Bible because it came to them through teacher figures as well as from their parents or their minister. Suddenly their teachers, who, and of course we all teach our children to respect teachers. That's our starting point. And in Christian education, we found we could really do that. And they started to be more interested in the Bible because their teachers were. A good teacher communicates their own enthusiasm for something. I remember that from my own school days. I had a really good teacher who imparted a lifelong interest in history because he had it. He wasn't doing a job, he was fulfilling a calling. We also discovered our children were more interested in everything. They were more interested in learning, generally, more interested in school itself, far more keen to go. Not this kind of long face and is it school again? They were more interested in worship. And we found that they were being profoundly affected by the fact that at last their home and their church and their school were singing from the same, I tend to say, psalm sheet as a covenanter. So they were singing like from that same psalm sheet. Their home, their school, and their church. What the Dutch used to refer to as the three-legged stool, it was stable. There was a consistency. There was a wholeness in their whole experience. And that was a profoundly moving thing. Now, I need to close because I've gone on for just way too long. It doesn't help that I can't remember when I started. I sometimes have this problem. I can't remember when I started. Is it right that I've been speaking for about 45, 50 minutes? Is that true? Roughly? Yes, well, I need to wind this up, and I'm going to wind it up. I wish I could say to you that, well, it's not just something I wish I could say, but I wish tonight I was addressing churches on this issue. I don't mean that they'd be better than you. I just mean it'd be so good if churches were really interested in this. But we found over the years that the churches were not. Because, and let me be honest, they were just too sleepy and stagnant. That's just the bottom line. They were either busy navel-gazing or with their heads very firmly in the sand. Most churches' idea of being cutting edge today is ripping out pews and putting chairs in and having screens in the sanctuary. Well, fine. That's not cutting edge. That is really not impacting the culture at all. Maybe, too, there was a fear of offending communities. Or, like I said earlier, maybe offending teachers. Like I said, Christian teachers are an army really waiting to be unleashed if we thought about it properly. As for not offending the community, to some degree that's what we're supposed to be doing. Or at least challenging the community. Or how about this? Presenting the community with an alternative. I mean, my ideal school in a deprived part of Glasgow would be that there was a school there that made a single mother feel, oh, that school changes children. That school down there changes children, does something with them. I'm going to send my child to that. Now, that's a Christian school that's working well. It's doing its job. And starting to pull people into the orbit of this evangelistic army of teachers and parents. For 30 hours a week, right? I'm not talking about sitting down at a table and drawing for a wee while. I'm talking about 30 hours a week of teaching. The last two people I saw coming to a Christian school from a non-Christian background where they had nothing, but for funny reasons, they ended up in the Christian school. Within 4 weeks, they were pestering their parents to buy a Bible for themselves and a catechism and a psalm book. That's what I call making a difference. That's a real difference when you think about it. So I wish I could be talking to churches, but I'm talking to you as parents. It's up to you. After all, it really is your children that you're raising in the 21st century. And just ask yourself, in closing, who's going to lead and guide your child from immaturity to maturity, from childhood to adulthood? From the age of 5 to the age of 18, who's going to be really responsible? You're with them for a few hours. If you're too busy parents, I don't mean T-O-O, I mean T-W-O. If you are too busy parents, maybe too busy as well, but if you're too busy parents, you'll begin to think about just maybe how little quality and quantity time that you have with your children. They're 30 weeks with other people, 30 hours a week with other people. That's a long time. Who are they going to be with? In what environment? Under what system? In what nurture? In what admonition? Who's training them? I'm not asking, is there a Christian teacher somewhere on the staff? I'm asking a more fundamental question than that. Which philosophy, which system of ethics, and which discipline is going to shape their minds? Someone's feeding your child. Someone's feeding your child, and the question is, who's it going to be? So it's your child, your choice, and your responsibility. So I think I should just leave it there. I had other things to say. I always do, but I just have to leave it there and pray that the Lord would help you think these issues through for yourself and for your children.